Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn that is hosted by the Cultural and Linguistic Diversity Committee. My name is Dr. Shaquana Freeman Green, and I am honored to moderate this conversation as we explore what it truly means to support culturally and linguistically diverse students with learning disabilities. This session is actually intentionally timed just before the holidays, a moment when many of us are reflecting, recharging, and recentering our purpose. We hope this conversation offers not just professional insight, but also encouragement and perspective. Today's panel brings together four powerful voices who will share their lived experiences, strategies, and lessons learned in this work. After the moderated questions, we will open the floor for your questions. So feel free to use the Q&A box or chat at any time. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves and tell us what brought them to this work, what continues to ground or inspire you, and then especially during this challenging season that we're in. So to get us started, Miriam, would you like to start for us?
Sure. Hello, everyone. It is an honor to be here. My name is Dr. Miriam Ortiz. I am the Executive Director for the Division for Learning Disabilities. And I was a classroom teacher in Tallahassee, Florida for students with behavior disorders and learning disabilities, middle school, so sixth, seventh, and eighth grade. And I taught math, science, and reading. If you're special educators, you teach a little bit of everything, right? What brought me into this work really was growing up. I grew up in a not very affluent household. Went to a school where a lot of my friends didn't graduate or didn't have the same support that I did with my family. And so I knew that really if they had a teacher who really believed in them and could motivate them, that maybe their lives would turn out differently. A lot of my friends ended up dropping out of school. And so I wanted to be that teacher. I wanted to be that person who made that difference. And so that's really where it all started for me. What continues to guide me is that there's still so much work to be done. There are still kids out there really that need that teacher, right? That person to inspire them and to help them believe in themselves. I also have a son who has ADHD. And so, that really gives me a whole new perspective as a parent as well, when it comes to advocacy and really making a difference for students with disabilities. So thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Ortiz. You bring like a wealth of experience. And I think you said something really profound, like there is still so much work to do. And we need folks to do it. So next on my screen, I'll go in order, is Dr. Jackson. So I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Dia Jackson. I will say, currently I'm a senior researcher at American Institutes for Research. I do professional development and research in special education, particularly around issues of equity. What brought me to this work is my graduate work at the University of Virginia. I was learning, how to be a special educator, and like many of you all, was exposed to the research around disproportionality in special education, which completely blew my mind and seemed like a very urgent issue that we need to address. So ever since then, that passion for making sure that our special education processes are producing more equitable outcomes has been a passion of mine. And that just partnered with my experience, similar to Miriam, as a special educator for almost 10 years, and having classes that were filled with Black and Brown students, seeing it firsthand. So not only in the research, but every day, and the challenges that we were facing in schools is really what brought me to this work. So I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. That is interesting work that you're doing, especially centering around equity. So we appreciate you being here today. And next we'll move to Dr. Myers.
Welcome everyone. I'm Jonte, currently an associate professor of special education at Georgia State University. My research focuses on mathematics interventions and in strategies for supporting the proficiency of students with and at risk for math difficulties. And what brought me here is the gift of math and how it changed my life. I'm from the Caribbean, and I simplify my story in this way by saying that the little bit of math that I knew made a difference. It's why I'm sitting here. So my work focuses on the critical arm of equity, which is proficiency, using evidence-based practices to build critical foundations for our students to learn more advanced mathematics skills. Happy to be here and to share my insight.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Myers. You and I share that passion and that love of mathematics. So I love that you're bringing that to this conversation for us. And our last panelist, definitely not least, Dr. India Lindo. Take it away.
Hi, as she said, I'm India Lindo. I'm a full professor of special education and core faculty in the Alice Neely Special Education and Research and Service Center at TCU. I'm also co-editor of the journal Exceptional Children for Us here with CEC. I've been doing this for a while, and I guess, different phases I hit different ways. My kind of interest in how people learn and the cognitive processes behind it kind of brought me, I guess, into teaching. But what brought me, I guess, into my current role as faculty and researcher had a lot to do with the narrative that I was hearing in the research world, and the patterns I was seeing working in institutions with large grants and huge data sets from around the city. And I'm seeing trends of how Black students are responding, but it's not being talked about. Or conversations about, like, free and reduced lunch, and like it's a monolith in those things. And like, I was a poor kid from New Orleans with, teen parents and all the other things that should be that I guess I just shouldn't be reading, yet I read it vividly. And so I was like, we don't examine this well, is I guess where I ended up. And also not understanding why some of the things I focus in comprehension. So my area is really looking at reading disabilities, learning disabilities, but how do we build comprehension for kids? And what I kept seeing was where our kids weren't included. They weren't, we were good at admiring the problem, as they say. The trends we've seen have existed and persisted since well before I was even alive, let alone in the field. Yet we spend a lot of time talking about the trends, but not including those populations in the solutions. And so that's what I aim to do at this point. I try to work to engage that, and that's I guess the why I persist, because the patterns persist, and the patterns of kind of I don't know, neglect of consideration or intention in solving the problems persist as well.
Wow. as you all are listening, as you can see, we have panelists here that just come from all different backgrounds. And so I am just going to dive into this, and feel free to jump in, unmute yourselves, and answer the question. We don't have to go in any particular order for these questions. But the next thing I would like for you all to touch on and talk about is what does culturally and linguistically responsive practice look like in your role? And could you share a moment where it mattered?
I mean, I'll go ahead and say something. I'll follow up on what I was just saying. To me, it looks like being intentional. Being intentional, including those populations and their voices in the creation of the solutions, and the in examining, I've been calling since I was in graduate school for us to differentiate outcomes, for us to make sure that we're actively looking at populations, thinking about linguistic variations, all of those things. So to me, it's being intentional about what we're doing and who we're including. That's to me, of course, it's a lot. I talk about cultural self-awareness, acquiring cultural knowledge, and preparing our educators to do those things as well. But as far as the scholarship, I think we've got billions in data, but are we using it in ways that are really being intentional to support our learners?
I'll elaborate on that. One of the key tenets of my work is the research to practice. Oftentimes, we do the research and we leave it right there, and someone else's job to kind of bridge that research to practice gap. I see that differently, and I am the bridge between that. And one of the things when we talk about being intentional is seeing math as a language. Mathematics is not language free, and there are sometimes these I would say polarizing issues in when we see math as a language. For example, everyday meaning of words do not always translate in the math world. For example, if you see the word table and a child learned that table was a piece of furniture, and then you see in math, it is something to display data. Evaluate in the reading sense, comprehension means to like give an opinion, but in math it means to substitute and solve. And I have a colleague who has a child with autism, and she shared a story where a teacher asked the child to evaluate an equation, and the child started saying, well, I think the equation looks right, it is well constructed, rather than actually taking any mathematical actions. My first time personally seeing the exclamation point in math, I'm like, why are my numbers shouting at me? Should I shout out this number 8 when it was actually the factorial in math? So being deliberate about helping students make those connections is critical. And in terms of research, we just did a study recently. It's in its infancy, where we were looking at significant predictors of math word problem solving amongst English language learners. And to our surprise, it's not the computations that matter the most, the measures of computation. It was the measures of language that predicted their word problem performance. So it means that we have to be more deliberate in terms of how we teach language. Mathematics is language as well. The vocabulary is essential, and helping students to contextualize the meaning within the mathematics framework is also important.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Jonte, and I would love to go ahead and expand on your comments. So yeah, when it comes to research to practice, that is my sweet spot. And so I work a lot actually in the literacy space. And so I think about it in that lens, and also in like the behavior space as well. So what for me, that culturally and linguistically responsive practice, first of all, looks like, really affirming our students' backgrounds and identities, and really understanding what that means and how that impacts their learning, right? So thinking about, all the other variables and factors that also come into the classroom, thinking about not just like equity issues, which are important, but as well like mindsets, right? And how that also impacts classroom and teacher feelings and the way students and families collaborate, right? So thinking about that, then also thinking about when it comes to teaching reading, right? We think the way that language plays a role in that, and the background knowledge that we have with our oral language and the sounds we hear, and for our English learners especially, right? So thinking about how in order to be able to reproduce a sound, right, or be able to read a sound or a phoneme, right, you need to be able to have that sound in your language. And so if it's a sound that you don't typically have in your native language, then you're going to have a little bit more of a challenge being able to identify and use that. So we have to be intentional about all those things. So really, I appreciate, Jonte, what you said about that intentionality and, really being explicit in what we think about and how we teach, and really understanding how all of that background, all those different things play a role in our students and our teachers' lives every single day.
I will connect to that as well. I am also in the research to practice space. My work actually focuses more on the systems level in schools and districts. So I do a lot of work with district leaders and state leaders, which is a really great opportunity to help get change at how we're making decisions, and looking at decisions in a more equitable way. So one of the projects that I am working on now is a collaboration with NYU, and we have the opportunity to provide technical assistance to district leaders across the state in special education. So it is a special education project, and our particular body of work is around equity in special education. So this is a really great opportunity we collaborate with other centers on the project that focus on behavior in special education, or LRE in special education and academics, or data in special education. And it's a great opportunity to collaborate with other experts and then provide that guidance to district leaders on how they can make different decisions in a more equitable way and integrate some of those culturally responsive practices. So one of the areas that we're focusing on a lot more this year and next year is around decisions in MTSS and database decision making. So we are developing toolkits and resources and providing training on how leaders can look at their data in a more equitable way. So kind of exactly what you were talking about, Miriam, is, what story are we trying to tell, and what story is being told, and how can we make sure that we are actually closing the gap? We're not just kind of going along and essentially tracking students, but calling it something different under the guise of MTSS or RTI. We are providing guidance so that district leaders can make sure that they have a more holistic approach to looking at their data and making decisions that lead to more equitable outcomes, so that they're actually really getting the full benefit of an evidence-based framework of MTSS. So that's really how culturally responsive practices are integrated into my work. As I said, right now we're focused on database decision making, but I'm also integrating that work into tiered supports. And what does culturally responsive practices look like at tier 1 when you are teaching math or reading, and then as well in tiers 2 and 3. So really excited to have that opportunity to work at the systems level.
Awesome. Thank you so much, you all. Wow. I hope our attendees are enjoying all of this as much as I am. This is amazing. And I want to shift just a little bit And I want to ask you all, what's a challenge that you've faced in this work? And then not only what was the challenge, but what's helped you move through that challenge?
So for me, the first thing that comes to mind is just to be frank, I think the fact that there are still a lot of thoughts out there and ideas out there that there isn't a disparity, right, in equity or in the opportunities, and that to me, it's disappointing. But I also understand that if you haven't lived it, right, you may not necessarily be aware of it. So I really try in all of my work and working with all different types of populations and backgrounds, really telling my story, right, and being able to um, hear and affirm other people's stories as well, but really, educating others on experiences of me and myself and those people around me.
Yeah.
And for
Oh, go
me,
ahead, Jen.
sorry, I'm sorry. For me, the challenge as a researcher bridging that gap between research and practice is when I have professional developments around word problem interventions, is getting the educators to understand that math and language are intertwined. They are married and they cannot be treated as divorced, right? They are not separate domains, but especially when it comes to word problems. Even outside of word problems, there is they are interconnected. And the assumption is usually, well, language belongs in the reading classroom or in English language arts, but math is filled with hidden linguistic demands, dense vocabulary comprehension. Again, we talk about relational words, symbols that carry meaning, etc. So I've worked through that by modeling how to make math talk explicit, showing teachers that small language adjustments can, change the flow and the fluency of instruction that really reaches the students who need it. So again, it's treating math and reading as interrelated entities rather than siloed, separated, concepts or domains.
And I want to throw another question out there for you, because I know some of you may work more with families or communities, but some of our attendees may want to know, like, what helps you to build trust with families and communities, especially when there are cultural or systemic barriers that are present?
Well, I'll, I'll jump in and just answer the first question around challenges. I don't work directly with families, so I'll let others respond to that. But one of the challenges that I face is really, since I am working with leaders who are extremely busy and already overwhelmed, it is a challenge in getting them to see something, why they should do something different than what they're already doing. So, a lot of times they're already overwhelmed with what they're already doing. So it's, if I'm trying to get them to do something different or integrate culturally responsive practices, that is the biggest challenge. So I put a lot of effort into making sure that I give them bite-size, very actionable strategies that they can do tomorrow, that are, not whole system-wide changes. So things like, look at your team and who is on your team and do you have diverse perspectives, right? So very simple, just look at who's on your team, list who's on your team, make sure that you have, parents at the table and that you have folks who have a positive relationship with the student at the table if you're making decisions around least restrictive environment. So that is really one of the hardest things, I will say, because it's behavior change and it's systems change work, which is complex. There are a lot of competing priorities and motives and compliance things going on. So that is really one of the largest challenges. I think giving folks some actionable steps and then connecting it to the broader outcome. So just continuing to bring them back to, you're impacting the lives of a student. You're impacting this one decision that you're making around what tier of support that they receive, or if you move them from tier 3 into special education, that is going to impact them for the rest of their life, and really just kind of bringing it back to how it impacts the student, and how, this team of people really has the power to kind of change a student's trajectory is one of the ways that I try to address that, and just making them see that culturally responsive practices is not like in a silo. It's not like something extra on top of what you're already doing, but it really is doing your job as a leader in a high quality way, so that in order to be a strong leader, these are things that strong leaders do. So connecting culturally responsive practices to what they already do is really a challenge, and that's something that I try to make sure that I am explicit about in my coaching and professional learning.
Well, and I'll piggyback on that in a couple of ways. I think also, are we addressing things that are priorities for them? Whose decisions are, I think we often are, there's a saying, nothing for us without us. Like, we're creating things and assuming that's what folks want. Now, I'm not saying that there's always, that maybe sometimes we you need to bring some different mindsets, right? I'm not suggesting that, but I think connecting it to their priorities, their understanding, because they are overwhelmed. Why is this meaningful for me? Because we often come in and offer a lot of great things. And I'll sometimes say, it's kind of like we bring in the folks are freezing and we bring in adult coats for a kinder classroom. It's like, where are they putting this stuff? It's too heavy. It doesn't fit. It's not doing this, like, because we have not actually engaged them in what are their needs. How does their system work? You can't teach who you don't know. You can't get buy-in from people that you haven't really communicated with. You can get compliance. You can get check, like, we're going to do this for a minute, but will it sustain? Will it be system changing? Will it really be adopted? We have to engage in more meaningful ways in those things, and thinking about the population and audiences that we're trying to serve. So I'll just say that, like, I think when she said chunking it, I'm like, yeah, or, they're like obvious things. I do reading interventions. It's like, I remember being on a team and they were doing an hour and like 20-minute intervention. I'm like, what middle school has an hour and 20-minute reading back? I mean, I know this is not specific, but it's like you already are setting it up to be not effective or not implemented the way you want because you want it this way. But I'm like, if that's not the reality that's ever going to really happen, how do we adapt in those ways? And so yeah, I'll stop there. I'm seeing the chat questions too.
Yes, I told you this is good. Go ahead, Dr. Myers, jump in.
Well, I've not done much work with families, but one of the things that I have as a researcher too is when you go into spaces with practitioners, is something that we have to do when we are tilted from a research intensive audience to a practitioner oriented audience. We have to get rid of the technical jargons. We have to simplify the language, make the language more accessible. And this is even more critical for the families of students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So it's critical that when we use response to intervention, below benchmark, processing speed, and these types of things, without translation, right, it can be overwhelming for those parents. So I would strongly suggest, based on my own experiences, because if I go into a room and I say effect sizes and meta regression, and people are like, what, right, is to really tame the language down so that it's more, they can understand it, contextualize it, and use it to make decisions, better informed decisions. So trust grows when families feel like we are naming their child's strengths as well and not just deficits, right? We have to, the deficits are sometimes a driver of instruction. I think things are foundational. There are some foundational skills that kids must develop. Um, but if we harp on those deficits too much, it can become a rather negative experience. So it's really using less of the technical jargon and focusing on also on the strengths of our English language learners.
And I just want to reiterate the trust part, because I have done in past things, and people start and then they're concerned about how their data is going to be used, because many have come, taken, and then what have I gotten for it? So I think, again, when we engage them in what are your needs? How do we build that up and really build it into the culture that is there? There's more of a kind of adoption, but there's more of a sense of this is really about addressing things that we care about and trust in that, not just you're just coming. It's just one more thing that we've got to do, and really you're just coming to get something and leave, kind of mindset. So, I mean, there are lots of research models around like learning labs and those kind of models that build together and co-create that knowledge with our participants and educators that are in the space. And so I encourage us to think about those kind of models.
I don't want to cut anyone else off. Anything else? Anyone else want to add about building trust? Okay, if not, what's something, then we'll move right along. And the chat is really blowing up and I'm trying to keep track of it. And so we're going to save a little bit at a time and make sure that we have your questions answered. Attendees, thank you so much. But for our panelists, what's something you've learned from a family or a community that has changed your perspective?
I think it kind of goes back to what India was saying earlier about just sometimes they just need someone to listen, right? And to really listen to what it is that they need or that they have experienced and really get an understanding of um, what their goal is so that you're getting that buy-in. So really helping to facilitate those things, it's important to really understand just where they're coming from, right? Like that, be a good listener. And I think sometimes as academics, right, we have a really hard time doing that, because we feel like we know what you need to do, and I feel like that sometimes too. I'll come into a PD and I really just want to say, hey, this is what you should be doing and this is what you should be doing, but no, we really have to listen and really facilitate those conversations so that there is that buy-in, it is collective, and we're just not telling people to do things or what should be happening. And so I think that in different opportunities that I've had to do some advocacy work with families, that really is what I have learned.
There's a question in the chat from John. Thanks for that question, John. This is a perfect situation where the intersection of race and socioeconomics come into play, right? Kids who from the population of interest in our conversation today, they are more likely to come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So how do we often tease out the difference between the two? It's not totally surprising that the effects, may not show up. Is there multicollinearity? And that's technical jargon. Now I'm going back to what I said before. Are these two things so interrelated that it's sometimes hard to just tease them out. So they overlap in so many ways that it makes it very difficult to separate or tease out those effects.
Well, and I was going to add to that also, and we have not done a great job as our field in measuring socioeconomic status. The
Exactly.
predictors that we often use are garbage.
Yeah.
It's my chalkboard moment of if you give me free and reduced lunch, anything else that we were trying to predict, we would not accept a 0.15 correlation. Let's get technical. As a measure of it, but we have and we do because it's easy. It's because what we've always done. We know, and even some of the other ways we've done it. So I can go off on a spill about that. We also have a tendency for groups that are connected to do and find the same findings. And we're not seeing other groups who've tried to do similar things be able to replicate those things, but they're not getting the same voice as others. So I think there's a number of things about that. The particular series that I think we're referring to that has been called into question, but has persisted despite that I think is a question. But bringing it back to the families piece and learn as well, just and this is actually not necessarily a heavily linguistically diverse group that I'm dealing with, but we have laboratory schools on our campus, and one of them particularly addresses kids with learning disabilities. And we got a new principal, and we were wondering, like, she looked at us like so crazy, and not us, like I wasn't doing it, but the administrator were constantly sending notes home to parents. Um, in these dense notes, and I think about us as researchers sending home these things about our studies for kids who are struggling. I tend to do struggling readers, right? And it was she was like, why aren't we just doing like voice notes to these parents? And the response rate from our parents, and these are highly engaged parents, they're paying for a pretty pricey private school on our campus, but they weren't answering really well, right? Unless they happen to be in the building, you catch them. So that conversation piece, right? And she's like, we know the apples often don't fall from trees. These same populations often are struggling or didn't have great experiences in school. They may be dealing with their own reading kind of thing. That's not what they're choosing to do, and but we're sending these long and dense letters about this study that we're doing, and then when they don't reply, well, they're not interested. Like, are there other ways that have we really engaged in how do we communicate? Like, so sometimes I guess my lesson is sometimes it's a far less complicated. Oh, it's just so hard to get these. Sometimes it's just that they couldn't read what they didn't know what you were talking about. It was too jargon. It was all this because the IRB wanted you to say all these things. You know what I mean? It wasn't like we didn't understand that it was complicated, but even having a voice call, having the teachers, something like that just increased our engagement numbers so much more. So sometimes, yeah, it's big. There's trust issues. We need to know there's one more thing they can't, I've had teachers be really frustrated about parents not showing up to things. But I'm like, it's conflicting with football and they don't think it should matter. But I'm like, it does matter. I'm in Texas, boo. It matters. Accept it and move on and figure out your new solution. So I guess I think I get back to knowing your population, thinking about the barriers, not just from your side, but from really more from their side. And how do you make that translation on kind of not just the intervention itself, but the procedural processes for it. And being really attentive to that to me has been the one of those kind of like that was so obvious, but why did it take a new person to come in and be like, why are you sending them parents that note? It was just the funniest thing because it was just like, yeah. Okay, never mind.
So I'm gonna piggyback on what you said. So in the two points that you made, the measurement issue, that's a critical issue that we have. We use socioeconomics. The proxy for socioeconomics is usually free and reduced lunch. And it's oftentimes not the best. There are other measures that we often use, mothers' education level, but I like to explore things, and that's one of the things that I get into trouble with. So now there are these statistical models that could take into consideration multiple measures of socioeconomics within the same model, and we don't have to worry if they are related or not, right? Because it doesn't assume any sort of parametric, correlations and that kind of thing. This is for the audience who understands statistical jargon here, but we are now able to include more of these measures to see which ones are really signaling the outcome. So I think that's a great way for us to move the field forward in terms of doing some more exploratory stuff around which of these measures are better suited for, you know, indicating students SES. And another thing you said in there that really resonated is the fact that the correspondence that we send home, the students that are struggling to read in our classes are usually the ones who have to go and relate it to their parents oftentimes, because their parents, the limited language that they know is much more comprehensive than what their parents already know. So if they're struggling in our classes to read, and then we are sending home correspondence that they themselves have to, read and translate for their parents, then we could see that there might be some issues with that as well.
Can I add to the barrier piece that you asked earlier too, because this is tapping in, is that us, we've been saying those things, Jonte. I mean, I came out in 2007 when my dissertation was looking at that and saying, hey, maternal education is a better predictor. John Duncan was saying it in the 80s. Getting us to move as a field. Disaggregating outcomes I've been calling for since I joined this field. And we just don't do it. It's the first thing we drop when, or that's not our priority. Because I think we also because we don't really subscribe that the problem is potentially how we're measuring or what we're bringing in. We still, the narrative of we can't, I remember being told, well, we really can't do anything about poverty. And I was like, what is free reduced lunch? What is public education as an entity, if not an effort to address? So like, I was like, I don't subscribe. I just subscribe that we haven't really made a concerted effort to. There are plenty of kids who are in the free reduced lunch group that read just fine, as I said, but also what are those predictors towards what? When it's coming from comprehension, maternal education is far more predictive, and it's a question. Just like I was like, if it was about the reading outcome you were measuring, but we talk about language mirroring, but we don't talk about African American English. But we run fluency measures all the time and score kids wrong on dialectal variation.
Yes.
Because we don't know how to measure it. We don't measure it, but all these, and when I talk about it with many scholars, because that's what I have, what do? I keep saying it. When we're at a group conversation about we're gonna study fluency, and I'm going, well, how we're measuring dialect, and they're like, oh, and then they go, well, it's the othering of that research. I, as a Black scholar, was discouraged from doing it because I should be seen as a scholar first and an African American second, right? But then when other people, it's for you to do. I'm not going to say, I don't want to talk about those patterns, or I don't, or it's not enough of a sample and those things. So, trying to push towards, we need to look at that. I'm like, who's the other? You've got the $5 million grant to look at this and the sample size. Why can't you look at this? Why can't you ask mom's education? Or why can't you disaggregate the outcomes? That's not some other research line to me. That is understanding your population. And so I advocate for that in real ways. Like, I don't think it's for others to do. I think it should be part of our normative behavior. And until it is, we're not going to change, because we can't address what we don't examine. Like I said, again, I take it back to, we admire the problem and the trends, but we don't address it in the solution building and creation.
I completely agree. And it's a great point that many measures, language measures, do not account for regional variation, or cultural variation. I'm from the Caribbean, and we don't put our TH, we don't pronounce it like that, like the, right? It's a whole different pronunciation. And even in the South here, I was driving through Georgia recently, and that became a conversation with one of my colleagues who's in the area of language. And she started talking about some of the way words are pronounced and accepted within certain communities. But when they are working with teachers and asking them to get their students to pronounce these words based on measures, these standardized measures, the pronunciations are coming up as incorrect. Like, so it's the dialect is so critical, and it is oftentimes just left to the wayside because of how we try to standardize everything.
And it creates a barrier. Like the further our regular normal discourse and our day-to-day discourse for us, whatever that is from the academic text, it's a barrier. It's another hoop. And we're not thinking about how do we intensify our interventions. I'm not saying that what we have is best practice is not effective for everyone in some ways, right? I'm saying, but this is until we know, when we know better, we do better. We do know that there are bigger hurdles to getting towards it that we need to bridge explicitly for kids. And we do that in many avenues, but we don't when it comes to certain dialects as one area in our language. But I also, we talk about those barriers in our practice. Like I said, how do we think about how we're engaging in this work, how we're considering those factors, what measures we are using, and again, what we are quick to let go of because of bandwidth or those things, because it's just a small sample, it doesn't matter, but we just
or because you're afraid that it's not going to get published because you didn't include this or you wrote it this way, and that too. And I feel like we don't talk about that enough either.
Right.
Yeah.
And like in Atlanta, there is this big thing about Ponce de Leon and how it's pronounced. It's different from how the Spanish will pronounce it, but locally it's accepted and understood. And if you try to pronounce it the right way, you get stares, right? So it's kind of like what happens when students dialects in the classrooms. Variation doesn't mean error per se, right? And if you have these sensitive measures that are just, not contextualizing that, we could find ourselves being overly, overly penalizing our English language learners.
Right. And, we have a summer literacy institute here. We brought Julie Washington this summer and talking about in language. And it was like every teacher in that space was like, no one's ever talked to me about that. Like, I'm like, baby, we're in Texas. Our district, this home district is 75% Latina. And a good chunk, the next biggest group is African American. I'm from Louisiana. I worked in Tennessee at Vanderbilt doing all those interventions, and honey, those teachers' dialects, when I'm trying to correct that, the teacher's pronunciation, we got a whole bunch of ers in this classroom. And how do I tell the teacher how she should say that? There are dynamics with all of this, right? And how we hear, how we perceive it. So how do we address that intentionally and recognize, hey, you're gonna, the flow, there are just so many things that we're marking. And we don't even get into what those barriers look like in our practice with many of these interventions. We did looked at one of the IES practice guides recently and looked at just the samples in the guide. I think it's in the Literacy Today magazine for IL, for Jalalubi and I looked at how did the recommendations hold when the population was 75% or more Black or Latina, Latinx or Hispanic, and the framing. What we like 5 recommendations, only 3 held. I don't know if I don't believe the other 2 don't. I just don't. We don't have the data to support it. And if we never look at it in the framing of, well, who, most effective for whom is always my question. Yeah. For whom? Because we know it's most effective for, our standard monolingual, whatever. But what about this large, more than 50% in many of our places across the country, population of public school students, that's not what they look like. They're not monolingual. They're not, a high SES. They're not, they're not suburban, whatever that most of our population is. I think Nicole Patton-Terry had an article where she was just talking about the majority of our reading research is occurring in spaces that are not reflective of the majority of our public school students in our country. Yeah. And that's not even dealing with disability. Sorry.
No, you're good. Like, this is great. I feel like we need like another hour. We can keep going. Like, this is amazing. But in the interest of time, I'm looking at the time and I want to open the floor up to our attendees. But before we do that, I have one final question for all of you. And that is like, if you could leave educators with one reminder or encouragement or some type of call to action for supporting CLD learners, what would that be?
I would go right back to my first premise. We have to stop separating language from content in general, and particularly in math. Every symbol, word, question carries meaning. And if students don't have access to that meaning, then anything else that we try to do will not stick, per se. So making mathematics language visible in your classroom, it's not just a best practice, it's the core of equity. So a simple math vocabulary word wall, where students can see the words and use of the correct terminology. It's the denominator and the numerator, not the bottom word, not the bottom number and the top number. So being deliberate in our use of mathematical language and that type of thing will be very critical for our English language learners.
I'm just going to co-sign and say everything is language. It's all about language. All of our assessments are about language. Whether it's a math assessment, science, social studies, I don't care. It's all language when we get down to it. And so, it's kind of, we can't ignore that, period. So.
Say in my space, in doing work around MTSS, one of the concepts that I have borrowed from Steve Goodman is this idea of contextual fit. And that contextual fit really has to do with making sure that your framework, your MTSS framework, or your interventions are aligned with the population of students that you have, and that is a key piece of fidelity as well. So that when you're implementing interventions, when you're implementing or you are providing instruction or assessments, that they need to match the population that you have. So if you are trying to implement an intervention that doesn't resonate with your students, or you're not getting buy-in, that's an opportunity to integrate some culturally responsive practices to increase engagement for your students. Of course, if your students are not engaged, then you're not going to see the benefits of that intervention. And similar to what we were just talking about, that intervention may have been studied on a population that does not match your population. So looking at all of those factors and making sure that what you are implementing and how you're implementing it matches with the student population you have is critically important to implementing an evidence-based practice or intervention with fidelity. So making sure that it matches with your student population is huge. I would leave you with that is making those changes is does not mess with fidelity. It actually increases your fidelity.
And I would say, thinking about just the way everything going on in our world right now, just remembering that, all of our interactions with teachers, administrators, families, they matter. And you can be someone who can make a difference in someone's lives and change the trajectory of their future. And so just keeping that in mind, in all the work that we do in all the different spaces that we're in, is really important right now.
I'll quickly piggyback on about the language. Like I said, I'm in Texas, and I got doxxed a couple of weeks ago because I'm my son being special education, with a focus on equity and inclusion. So that's lively. I just think let's not get hung up on the terminology either. The work is what matters. I think we're talking about persistent reading difficulties in my space, whether or not it happens to be disproportionately, there's stuff about justice and liberty. Someone told me they just got a big grant that's very much what they would say DEI, but they've been using the things about liberty and equity. as the conversation point. So focus on the kids in the work, or the population in the work, because it's not always kids, I recognize, but and don't, because the rest of it is distraction. And these kids still need us. I keep saying kids because I work in elementary. But and the adults supporting them need us to be there and to be those, to provide the supports needed.
Thank you all so much for your perspectives and insights. We will now open the floor to questions from our attendees. So feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. I do see that our panelists are amazing and they have been answering your questions as you have been putting them into the chat. And there is one that I saw from Suda. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and I don't want to butcher your last name, but it says like what this individual is asking, what is one book or resource that you all are reading or you're reading about, or something that you would recommend to our audience?
I was actually looking it up on my phone. It's an old text, but and I'm gonna give another shout out to Julie Washington. She's been talking. I do a lot right now at the Science of Reading at the Intersections, and I've been dabbing into language. And so she talked about this book that she read as a graduate student. So again, not a new text, but The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And she shares that as a kind of like where we are in these movements in education. It's always funny to me because all these people talk about this new fandangle science of reading, and it's all I've ever known coming out of a special ed background. So I'm like, what were y'all doing? But I learned quickly what folks was doing was not what I was doing. And so I've been looking at that and thinking about, how are we moving as a field in this aspect of scientific inquiry? So it may not quite be in line. Also, Zaretta Hammond has a new book out, and I'm intrigued in seeing what that's about. So that's on my order list.
2 books. I'll put them in the chat. The first, The Sum of Us, which is a great perspective on how inequity impacts all of us, not just students and people of color, but it impacts our entire society. And then the other book that I will always recommend is High Leverage Practices for Inclusive Settings. It is some have called like the Bible special ed, but definitely one that I'm proud to have been a co-author on, and give some very clear guidance on effective strategies for students with disabilities and students who struggle. So I will put that in the chat as well.
The CEDA Center has some resources also. I think that's what Dia was referring to. So I would, yeah, Dia has covered that base. It's a pretty resourceful technical assistance center, and there should be some things there that you could leverage.
So as executive director for DLD, I have to promote our DLD materials and our DLD website. There are lots of free resources that you can use and you can search on there. We're also working on building a YouTube channel with lots of videos to support teachers and faculty members who teach teachers. And then also for those who work with families, I really enjoy using understood.org as a website that has really great information that is very digestible for families and teachers as well.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing your insights, perspectives. I see others are dropping more in the chat. This is so wonderful. I'm glad you put a plug in for Understood there. I have Solve 2.0 that is coming out with which is a math intervention training manual for teachers. So be on the lookout for that coming out. You should see that soon. And it is right at 1 o'clock. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you all again for your presence, panelists, for your stories and the impact you have made on behalf of the CLD committee. We are so grateful for your work and your willingness to share it here. We will follow up with a resource guide and a brief feedback form for our attendees. And if you're interested at all as you're listening and getting involved with the CLD committee, or you want to stay connected, please reach out to us. I am Dr. Freeman Green, and I'm wishing you all a restorative and joyful holiday season and renewed energy to continue this important work. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.